I'm your host, John Sleeting, and today I'm joined by Dr. Kent Rhodes.
The aspect of wealth and what that can do for the family is both mostly positive ways, but also some challenging ways. I find that conversation to be really important. And it's one that comes up whether I bring it up or not. It's not a question of whether or not there's enough wealth or money going around, but it's a question of whether or not they've actually ever thought about how they could leverage some of their wealth to see other opportunities for good in the world. Introducing the idea sometimes is, and planting the seed is as powerful a thing as I can possibly do.
Hello, and welcome to Clear Conversations, the Entrepreneurial Legacies series. I'm your host, John Sleeting, and today I'm joined by Dr. Kent Rhodes. Kent has just got a fantastic breadth of knowledge and lived experience, from working in family therapy to launching his own entrepreneurial venture in business, to going through a liquidity event, to working within an academic environment at Pepperdine University, to working directly with families and philanthropic aspects of his work, to working with a family business consulting group with family businesses, so that all families can thrive and make a difference in the world that they see, that they want to make a change in, not only from their business, but also through their family. His perspectives, his knowledge, his wisdom and understanding, I encourage listeners to just listen really closely. A few times you might even want to pause and rewind to take in his thought process. Again, from a very practical application, but coming from this depth of wisdom and experience that he brings to the subject matter that we're going to engage in today. So it is absolutely with my pleasure to introduce Dr. Kent Rhodes as we engage in this conversation. Kent, thank you so much for carving time out from the West Coast to join me here as we stream this episode to talk about philanthropy and strategic philanthropy. I love the perspective that you bring into this. We got acquainted through the Family Business Consulting Group, but before I share too much more, we'll start with what does the word legacies mean and the concept of legacies mean to Kent Rhodes?
Thank you, John. Yeah, in all of my work with families and their enterprises, legacy always comes into the conversation really early on. And what I find is that families really have resonance with the idea of legacy because that's really what they're wanting to do. Their enterprises may be really successful and they may be have provided for families, not only their own family, but families and communities. But then they start thinking very appropriately about, well, what does this mean for us? What do we want to leave long term after we're gone? And even after pieces of the enterprise might have shifted. So to start thinking about what that means for people is really a meaningful conversation. And I find that whether or not they've been able to articulate it or not, they've been thinking about that. Yeah. And so I always find that that's a great conversation to engage with families.
I love your observation, right? It's hard to articulate. And sometimes, right? I mean, I try to simplify it, or even in my own mind, I try to boil it down to, okay, it's impact and this impact that you want to leave behind. But then that leaves you wanting for more. It's like, well, what impact, right? And what does that look like? And then how do you actually add a definition to that? And so for listeners to get to know you a bit, because first is my introduction, they'll always get to know you more, to go through because you've got this wonderful breadth of experience that you bring to this. So I'll let you share a little bit more of that short resume, so to speak, and then we're going to go down some different paths.
All right. So I'll try to be fast here without boring anybody too much, but I've always had my professional life in at least a couple of different areas. And so I have a master's degree in family therapy and enjoyed doing that work many years ago. But as I learned more about organization and learned that family systems applies to organizations as well, I got really interested there. I have an entrepreneurial background as well, so I was able to have a startup, manage that, was CEO and co-founder of that, and then sold it. Then at that point in my career, Pepperdine University called and said, we don't know many people that have the kind of background that you do educationally. Would you come teach in our executive programs for us as what they call a clinical professor, which means I'm not technically an academic. I actually still work. Um, so I said yes to that, and was happy to engage with that. So I still do that today. I teach in two primary programs. We have a PhD program in global leadership and change, and then a Master of Science in organization development. Right after that, the Family Business Consulting Group also called and said, hey, we think your dedication to working with families, you could really help us. Would you think about joining us? And so I did that in 2006. And I've been with them since then and have really enjoyed that work. So the combination of the academia and being in the classroom with executives, and these are mid-career people, they're not kids. So their motivation is different and their view on the world is different, and what they're trying to do is really wonderful.
Well, in a family business, and this when when I open and say you have this lived and shared experience from family therapy, so family business, right? When we speak to that, it starts with the family, so the family therapy component. But then the business, you're running an operation, you need to run it with excellence. You need all functions and being a great business person. And just because you're part of the family doesn't give you a pass on being a great business person as part of that. At least it shouldn't in the nature of that. So when you go back to your early days of family therapy and working with families and the dynamics of families, overlaid within this broad concept of family business, but also family wealth, even more broadly, where the business is part of the overall wealth picture. And you look and you juxtapose what you know now today versus where you started with family therapy. Just some of the issues, some of the pitfalls, because most families say, yeah, we don't want to screw up the subsequent generations with the sake of the wealth or the business, and yet, given that early on work in your professional life, you were seeing a wide range of outcomes to help people avoid the pitfalls. What are some of those major pitfalls, and how would people avoid them?
I think one of the ones that I see the most often is a disconnect, is what I would call it, an unintended disconnect between the wealth that comes and the values that the family actually holds, and finding ways to help them get that kind of alignment. And so it's interesting in therapy, to help families think about their values and that in just a more normal kind of a context. It still rings true. You pull it forward into an enterprise, but the aspect of wealth and what that can do for the family is both mostly positive ways, but also some challenging ways. I find that conversation to be really important, and it's one that comes up whether I bring it up or not. It always comes up. There's always a conversation at least once of that aspect. The other part of it is, and sometimes they're related, is families are made up of people that love each other, but there are conflicts. They're different personalities, and sometimes that becomes an issue, and even to the point sometimes of there being cutoffs where there's a family member that says, I don't want to be a part of this. I don't want to be a part of the family, or vice versa. And so part of my work, both as a therapist, when I was doing therapy, I don't do therapy anymore. I'm really clear about that with my clients. It's like, I have that background, but I'm not here to therapize you. So,
Right.
but the thought of how do you manage that kind of context with any potential conflict when there is wealth involved, and when there is a sense of how do we bring in the next generation, for example, to lead and to govern,
Yeah.
and who should be able to do that. One of the things we talk about is that fair is not necessarily equal.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
just because I have the right last name doesn't mean that I can be the next CEO.
Yeah.
So, figuring those
Wow.
things out are important.
I'm definitely not a clinician when it comes to to therapy. Yet you can't help you, but find yourself in these conversations because emotions can run high. How people's belief systems, the thoughts, the different perspectives as emotional beings that we all are. Sometimes when you're navigating these conversations, you can't help but feel like, okay, are we in a therapy session or not? As we're all trying to do the right thing. Um, when you mentioned earlier, even if the conversation's not happening, it's happening, and kind of playing that back. And I've heard some people saying, well, we don't want to talk about it because we don't want to make money, a thing, right? We don't want to make it. And I'm like, but by not talking about it, you are. How do you coach families? How do you encourage them to be like, well, what is the appropriate timing, sequence, levels of maturity? How far do you go? Is there, and nothing's prescriptive, right? But how would you describe a healthy approach to the topic?
Well, first of all, if I don't hear that they're open to a conversation about that, I will bring it up and say, I haven't heard you say very much about this. I'm wondering where you are in this context about this topic in general. I also get a really good sense from usually generations 2 and 3 to what extent there's been a conversation about that. In fact, I was working with a family recently in which generation 3, in their 30s, have no idea at all about the finances of the company, what is coming to them when a trust comes open to them. And they're struggling with that a little bit because they're beginning to want to plan for their own families. And so, yeah, if it's not present, a part of my job, I think, is to gently and kindly continue to put on the table the topic.
Yeah.
And there's several of those, but certainly the money piece is an important one.
Yeah. The individuals that may not want to engage in the conversation or distance themselves or avoid, how do you even bring them together? What is the families that are out there right now might be first generation entrepreneurial wealth creation. Some kids may want to be in the business, others don't. How would you even in a best practice script out, well, what does that first meeting look like? The
Yeah.
invitations, the dialogue, we don't have to solve it all in one meeting.
Well, in fact, I'll do a little bit of expectation setting. And if they haven't been having regular family meetings, then I will say, you need to have regular family meetings. And I know this from my own experience over and over and over again. And I know that it gets difficult when you start getting into multiple generations. It's really difficult to get scheduling done. But generally, I ask for an initial all hands family meeting. And best case scenario is if it's in someone's home, that's great if they got enough space for that, or combine it with a family vacation, which I find to be a little bit more common, that there's maybe once a year, the family will get together someplace. And so I say, it'd be good to carve out a half day, maybe a day even of that, in which we can come together and have conversations and include even some of the kiddos, as young as ages 11 or 12. Into some of those conversations. So they begin to get a sense of what is there as well. I have always, to a person, found that has been appreciated once they're able to do it, and has found that then sets up expectation for further conversation because they themselves see, this is not a one and done conversation. We need to have this as an ongoing dialogue as we mature with our business. And that's one of the other things that I try to do is try to help the family keep up with the strategy of the business. So their own strategy, what does that look like? And including both finances and wealth and values and their own family's mission and philanthropy.
And I promise listeners, we're going to get and bridge this all towards, the philanthropic piece of it. Last question on the family, and I do encourage listeners, go back, did a family governance mini series not too long ago, and just some great different viewpoints that came in from our different guests that I had there. But I think you just got such a unique perspective that bridges all these different areas that come together with the family component, and maybe those early on meetings. When you think about the quote unquote in-laws, the son-in-law, the daughter-in-law married into the family, I've heard some people be like, unless they signed a premarital agreement, they're not going to be included. They have to be committed for at least 10 years in their happy marriage before they can be included in the meeting. All of these just different views, right? Newly married. Yeah, we'll see what happens. Again, how do you even navigate or help the family make those decisions regarding the all hands that you said, right? Well, who truly is even all hands? That's a question into itself.
It is, and those are all excellent questions that we have to navigate. So, I think my approach is, and again, this is based on my experience, and so it's been pretty consistent. That doesn't make it right every time, but I think my experience has been, let's bring everybody in the room, and be really clear about defining who family is, and that's one of the first conversations we have to have. How do you define family? How do you define adopted children? How do you define
Mm.
same-sex partners? I mean, all of those things that come into play, the family needs to have an agreement about. And then the second part of that is, I always try to be really clear about here's a best practice that you need to think about is that in-laws, married-ins, it's probably not best for them to have ownership of any of the enterprise. Engagement, yes, if they are qualified, sit on boards, sit as a leader someplace you work with the family council that they may have in place, but and have access to as much of the wealth, cash, cars, boats, houses, all of that can be theirs. But ownership them is the reason it becomes a little bit dicey, them not knowing what the future holds. And so
Mm.
the goal being, let's keep the ownership of the enterprise within the family really clearly. In the case of any sort of event, death, a divorce,
Yeah.
remarriage, any of those scenarios, which happen to all of us at some point,
Mhm.
is to protect the enterprise itself. And it isn't to limit the access to sharing the wealth with in-laws at all,
Mm.
but to make sure that the enterprise stays safe. I've seen too many situations where there's been either a death. Well, let's just take that situation of a death and the stereotypical way in which shares of the owner, partial owner or full owner, goes to the spouse, the remaining spouse, and stereotypically that's the wife, and she may have no idea about what the business governance is like. She may not be interested in that. It's a lot to put on a person. But it was done as just under the umbrella of wealth transfer. But there are other ways to do that that you know very well, and so we really try to encourage that. Also, I've seen the scenario where after that death, a younger person remarries and has other children, that then suddenly there are children that are not related at all to the
Yeah.
founders or to the owners that become shareholders and sometimes can own a significant number of shares. And so then that means that the governance and the vision and values begins to siphon off and to weaken a little bit.
Right,
So so
right.
so we think about those things. Sorry, I could talk about that
No,
for a little
gosh,
while because
it is,
I
and
run into
get my
this all the time.
and as you're talking through it, Ken, there's the collision between family governance and business governance,
Yes.
right? And you try to keep those separate because a lot of people just try to lump those all together and they solve all the problems in one. It's like, well, no, I really do encourage keep your family governance as much as you can separate from the business governance because the natural gravitational pull is going to be to pull those items together for what you just had. So as you were speaking through that, that was just clicking through my mind again. Now, with a lot of our entrepreneurial listeners, sometimes I get feedback to step back, going, "Okay, John, sometimes you come at this from this academic viewpoint, right? From a little bit of a clinical viewpoint." But on the business side, you also have a lot of street cred when it comes to business. So let's set aside the where you started your career and talk a little bit about your business because I think people, right or wrong, right, look at it and go, okay, wait, he does understand what I'm talking about. Can you share a little bit about your business
Yeah,
line?
yes. I refer to myself as an accidental entrepreneur because some of the work that I was doing, I required a certain kind of technology that I couldn't find anywhere to use, and so a good friend of mine, where I grew up in Lubbock, Texas, is a brilliant technologist. He still is to this day, and I called Todd and I said, "Hey, I explained what I was needing, and he said, let me work on that for a little bit." And about 3 months later, we talked along the way, but 3 months later, he said, I think we have it. So sure enough, they developed this platform that I was needing, and it became really clear all of a sudden that yes, I could use that, but it was also a business. And so
Mhm.
Todd and I talked together, and we incorporated and became, like I said, we started it together, and I was CEO and ran it because he was doing all his own stuff in Texas. And so And lo and behold, we began to grow, and we grew rapidly. And I found that I really enjoyed that work. Finding the right people, filling slots, finding good spots for us to open offices in Irvine, California, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Austin, and Lubbock. And we did really well. And then we started getting calls, of course, because we were doing well, getting calls from companies that were looking to acquire. We said no many times for a very long time. And finally, a publicly traded company called, and we thought, if we lose everything, we can start again. And so we decided to take that deal, and became a part of a roll up with a publicly traded company in San Jose, California. Through all that, I learned so much about what needs to be done in business, and especially as an entrepreneur. And the thing that I enjoyed most about it was the constant thinking on my feet and pivoting to make decisions and creating a board that was useful and helpful to me. But I also learned things because, as is common, the company that bought us also handcuffed me for a year, which is really common. And I served on the board for the publicly traded company and served as a part of their senior executive team. And I found all kinds of things in that context that were bad practices. And so I learned the other side of what never to do. And so, but that's kind of a broad part of my story there. But I really relished all of those experiences and really appreciated every bit of it. I learned so much and enjoyed
what was
it.
the time horizon? What was the time horizon from kind of inception and founding to the sale plus a year?
So from inception to founding to sale was 6 years. So it was pretty quick.
Yeah.
Our growth was fast, but revenues were solid. This was back a few years ago, but we were a real company. We weren't a .com. It was common back in the late '90s. Some people might remember that, but.
So from founding, right? Necessity was the motherhood of invention once again, and coming up with this, teaming up with your partner. Some of those early lessons, because you went through an entrepreneurial life cycle, right? And 6 years is a short time to go from launch to
It is.
an exit like you did. So that life cycle, take us through the stages of that from your own learning and expression, and how you'd go back and say, what would you tell to yourself along the way, given the years of wisdom now, and then in reflection of what you would have done differently.
Yeah, looking back now, what I wish I had known was that I had the foresight to say, I need to create this, and it's going to be a business. I think that there was a lag time there because I was still in the mentality of family therapist
Right.
and wanting to provide service and help, families. And so, I think for me, had I been able to have a little bit more of a business sense prior to that. That said, I don't have an MBA. I do have a doctorate degree in management now, but at the time, I didn't have any of that, and so I learned what I would say the hard way. That I wouldn't change. That I think that I had good mentors, and that's the other piece of it that I didn't mention. I would, if to do it over again, I would have leveraged more of my mentors. And I had several of them. I was at least smart enough then to know that there's a lot I didn't know, and I needed to have some advice. So, like I said, I pulled together a good, solid group of board members that had great experience as entrepreneurs and had been very successful in their work.
If we could pause on the board item for a moment.
Yeah.
Because it's one of those items. A lot of times, entrepreneurs, what's the adage, right? If you want to go fast, go alone, and if you want to go far, and when you're moving fast, a lot of times people pause and look at a board in corporate governance as slowing them down on their entrepreneurial journey. How do you dispel that? How do you dispel that myth? In my mind, it's a myth regarding what good governance can look like to actually accelerate what's taking place.
Absolutely. For me, fortunately, I thought, I need entrepreneurs. And so I need entrepreneurs that are seasoned, that have done entrepreneurship, that have maybe done several startups, that have done maybe even had an exit or two, so that they had that sense. So it wasn't they were all just brand new entrepreneurs. So that was the first thing
Mhm.
I would say, and I made sure they were a lot older than me.
Mm.
So when I say seasoned, it wasn't just experience wise; it was also that they had years of experience
Mm.
that I was far, far, far away from. And my mentality has always been sort of the opposite. I need to slow down to go fast.
Mm.
And for me, that proved to be really that was huge for me, and was really significant. So the time I spent with advisors and mentors that served as board members was extremely valuable. And yes, it was aggravating in one sense to sit in a meeting, sit in long meetings, actually maybe even do an offsite, which we did. Um, that I found that to be way more valuable than just going with my head down and never stopping.
And can you put your finger on like what the value was? So slowing yourself down, where my mind goes with that is getting out of the tactical and the grind of the work itself to actually give yourself that margin to process more strategically. Which if a board's operating in the right way, it really should be much more strategic, looking out into the future and leaving the running of the operation to the CEO. When you put your CEO hat on,
Yep.
of being in the depth of it, can you put your finger on like how that really, empowered you or gave you that freedom to grow, to work even better or faster?
Well, absolutely, and you've hit on the dynamic. I'm in day to day trying to make things work and making things work and building, making sure relationships are what they should be across the company. So we work very efficiently. So to come together with people that knew strategy really well, again by their own experience, in this sort of a fast moving context, was really helpful to me. And the slowdown part was I had no choice but just to listen,
Mm.
and that which I found extremely helpful. Now, and the strategy came at two different levels because the other part of it was they were familiar with our operations. They were familiar with what I was dealing with, so that they could help me scan the environment to create an ongoing strategy. We revisited our strategy often. Unlike I worked with an enterprise recently that they did a strategy every 6 years, and I questioned that. It's like that's a long time to
Yeah,
not
yeah.
be engaging with the environment. But we revisited our strategy in that fast environment every 6 months, and
Well, okay.
so it became. I mean, that's a lot, but I found it really helpful because it gave me more nuanced direction in terms of what we were trying to build there. The other part of the strategy was for me, with their understanding of how I was working and what we were doing, was where are my blind spots? Where do I need to move myself out of the way because I might be causing some of the backlog? And that I found really helpful too, because we had developed the kind of relationship that they would tell me, and they did tell me. Um, and most of the time, I listened. There were a couple of times I didn't, but they were almost always spot on about that. And I think that was something that I would say is what the combination of the two things, them listening to people that were wise about strategy and listening to their context and what they were saying, and giving me feedback about what was helpful, I think are really, really important. What I find though is with other entrepreneurs that I work with sometimes is that's hard, both in terms of what you've already mentioned, slowing down, but also, uh, I want to act like I know what I'm doing all the time, and so yeah, I don't need your feedback. And at least for me, this was really an important piece for me is to be able to build that in, and I say that comes from my background with working with families and counseling. It's like, oh, I'm going to apply this to myself.
Yeah,
This might be something
yeah.
I would say to someone else, but I'm going to apply it to myself. And I was really grateful that I was able to do that.
Well, did you sit in the as a CEO, were you also the board chairman, or did you have someone else chairing the
I,
board?
I was also the board chair.
Okay, so organizing the agenda and organizing the inputs. How big was your board when you started it?
It was just three when I started. So
Okay,
we were small, but like I said, I was more interested in finding trusted advisors than
yeah.
building a giant thing.
Did you add in more as you were approaching then the exit?
I did added two more.
Okay. And what different roles did the different individuals play just so that it wasn't an echo chamber and everyone wasn't just saying the same thing?
Well, they weren't all from the tech industry, so they came from different industries, which was also important to me. Now there were two of them that were very much involved in the tech industry, but others came from other areas, and in fact, I even had one from a nonprofit that actually it was from a foundation,
Mm,
um, and then a couple other different industries. But that gave me some confidence that kind of looking across different areas. Two of them also were from family enterprises, which
mm.
at that point in time, I wasn't thinking particularly about that, but I found that to be really helpful as well in that moment. And because I also find that a lot of entrepreneurs are working in a family-like context and
Mhm.
actually might be engaging their family to do some
Right.
work, especially if they're
Right.
still working out of the garage. People, people have jobs. So, um,
So how did the board conversation itself evolve when you go from those early days of three of you, you start bringing in other individuals, and then you start entertaining the potential of a sale. And as you looked at that event, kind of that the ebb and flow of that dialogue amongst the board, how did that change to best support you in the decision making as the CEO?
Yeah. I think that early on when we started getting all kinds of offers and calls, this was a conversation I always brought that to them. Here's here's the latest one that I'm getting. Here are the multiples they're offering, or here's what they think. What does that mean? And of course, we had our own valuation that we did on a regular basis. But I think that they were really helpful to me because they were the ones that initially said, let's hold off.
Mm,
We're not sure from a strategic standpoint because of the growth that you're experiencing and that where you are. And so I found their advice to be really helpful in terms of well, let's not jump to this really quickly here. Let's think about this a little bit. And so I found that really most helpful. Not that I would have made a quick jump because I wouldn't have done that. I tend to be a little
yeah.
bit more conservative, even to the point that when they finally said, you know what, this one might be worth looking at, I kind of went, oh, are you sure? So I questioned them about that, but it wound up being a good call.
Is there any aspect, if you look back, a situation, a discussion, constructive conflict that took place that really ended up changing trajectory for you in some form or fashion as a CEO that took the business in a little bit of a different direction that you look back on and say, "Yep," and that was the right call.
Yeah, I think because we were growing, there were a couple of there was one board member and there were a couple of executives that I had working with me that just wanted to push and push and push and push and again, I tend to be a little bit more conservative, and I kept thinking, growth is good, and we were still, certainly doing appropriate work in terms of growing and reinvesting in the company, but there were some people that wanted to really, what I'd say, work us thin.
Mm,
Um, and and so to say there was disagreement about that, and
mm.
so but I felt confident enough to say, yeah, I think that we're growing fast enough for a minute. Let's not continue to push just because we can. And was
Yeah.
able to push that back a little bit.
Did it
Um,
help having the board to point to it all in terms of being like, you know what, team, for the operating team being like, "Yep, had a board meeting and here's where it's coming out." That gives you a little bit of actually a shield.
Totally, and in fact, one of the things the advantages that we had of doing the strategic plan every 6 months, if not more than that, was I was clear. We stick to the strategy because it is as hard as strategies are to pull together,
Mm,
and even though there's still a lot of guessing and hoping that goes into strategies, it's based
right.
on data, and so we had done that work. So I was able to easily lean on. Here's the strategy that the board has put forth, and I've worked with them on that, and I'm confident about that. It's worked for us up to this point, and let's stick to that. So that was nice to be able to say, well, this isn't just a matter of my opinion. It is my opinion, but we've got some good data to back it up, and it is our
Yeah.
strategic plan that we're gonna grow, but we're gonna do it in a measured way.
So as we build from family therapy and working with families directly to now your own entrepreneurial journey and sale of a business, One thing I often encourage, and whether it's just traditional retirement for listeners or whatever that major transition is life, it's gaining the clarity of what's purpose look like on the other side of whatever that is. So when you sell your company, what's the purpose? It doesn't have to be the next day where you've got that figured out. But if you don't, in time, you're going to feel the pressure of needing to figure that out for yourself, because you're going to get, even the most avid golfers are like, I can't golf this much, right? I need something more to do, or on the boat, or whatever it might be, in the nature of it. So when you go through your own you go through your continued contract then in terms of serving with the business. But then on the backside of that, I'm guessing you're also stepping back going, okay, now what's next? When you take these two big blocks of family therapy in the business, what's next for yourself? And then you end up in this dialogue with Pepperdine, if I've got that right.
You got it. Well, so after everything was done, I thought, well, I'm not sure what do I want to do? And so you've hit it perfectly. It's like, what is my purpose now? It's like,
Mhm.
so I had all my stuff in storage in Laguna Beach, California, and I came down here and I was going to load it all up and move to Austin, where a lot of my family is, and that's when I got the call from Pepperdine. I just hadn't ever considered teaching like that, and I thought, well, maybe I have something to offer with that. And so I think I was very lucky. I think I think it's rare for somebody that quickly to get a call, and then it made sense to me. It wasn't a life preserver. It was, hey, we recognize that you could contribute to other executives in this way. And that was interesting to me. And
Yeah.
so, like I said, I think I was very lucky that I got a call like that. Um, uh, and Pepperdine is a good school, so it's a decent place, and I work with good colleagues, and so I didn't know that at the time as much, but I do now. So that was
Turns
good.
out. So I actually was out at Pepperdine just for a 1-week program on financial management for the family office.
Yes, right. Yeah,
In
good.
beautiful. So for those that aren't familiar with Pepperdine, the 2-minute commercial on Pepperdine University, the programs, a little bit from the piece of property that you sit on in the university and where you're at in the world is pretty nice. So what would be 2 minutes on a Pepperdine overview?
It's the campus itself. The undergraduate campus sits in Malibu, California, up on the hill, and so there's 180-degree or more view of the ocean, and it's very distracting to try to teach a class anywhere that has windows. But it's a really good place. Really historically has been very dedicated to entrepreneurship and to leadership, and that's kind of across all the programs there. And the mission of the university is to prepare people for leadership and service. And I resonate with that too. I think that's really good. The executive programs I teach in are not in Malibu. We meet around the world. So we have, in fact, I'm working with a group of doctoral students this summer in Vevey, Switzerland. We have a campus there, and in Italy, and all over the world. So I get to do that, and I enjoy that too. So
when Pepperdine identified this opportunity in the marketplace, this need and your uniqueness, given your background, that you could bring into it, what was it that they're trying to put their finger on, or how would they describe, here's the need in the market that you can come in and educate on?
Yeah, great question, because at that time, they had an executive program in technology management. So they were they had a program, and it was actually in San Jose, California, where we actually brought in executives from the tech industry and walked them through and helped them learn good leadership and management practices. So that's what they had in their mind. Of course, that's why it was such a perfect fit for me to join them. And since then, evidently, I did a good enough job of teaching and enjoyed it enough that they said, "Hey, we've got a couple other programs too we'd like to plug you into." And to the point that at one point, I chaired our executive MBA program, and enjoyed that as well. And then, like I said, started moving into teaching in PhD programs.
And so what's the most joy you get out of the work you do then with students?
Yeah, like I said, because they're all at least mid-career executives, and really smart people. Personally, the thing I enjoy the most is I still learn tons from them. And so I enjoy that a lot. That my learning just continues. And by the way, I feel really again lucky that I have such a symbiotic relationship with my teaching and the work that I do with family enterprise because they work together. So my experience in the field working with these large enterprises, man, all of my examples, and I warned students beforehand. I said, my examples are going to be from family enterprises, and if I were able to tell you who they were, you would recognize some of them. And so, they're not small mom and pop kinds of things, but it goes back and forth as well because then I have a pretty clear sense of the recent things that have been published and what is happening in the world. And I find that really helpful and I enjoy that too. And then the other piece of it is, I think, for especially the leadership and management piece of it, it's the duality of managing an organization and managing people and then managing self. And I love getting this hits back to my original, my original education. Love when people begin to see the benefit of being self-aware and being able to understand the impact they have on other people and vice versa, and then be able to manage their own behavior in a way that brings success to the organization. I love that. I love when that clicks.
The one of my son-in-laws did his Master of Science in Computer Science, Engineering Management at Stanford.
Oh, wow.
So being in Palo Alto right there, and he's just like, oh my gosh, there's just so many brilliant people around this, right?
Yes.
So you talk about kind of San Jose north up through Silicon Valley for listeners that might not be familiar with the geography. You're just running into like brilliant people that are changing the world in so many technology ways. How do those individuals, and broadly, right? And everyone's unique in their own right. When you walk into the room and you've got this group of individuals in front of you, what are the particular unique challenges or those items that you learn from how they think? Again, they being very broad, but how they think versus maybe how a lot of the rest of the world envisions the future.
Well, and again, I think that's where my experience came in really handy. I came with an assumption, and I told them that one of my assumptions is that my life before I started teaching in the classroom might resemble some of what you are doing and experiencing. Let's test that. And
Mhm.
so I found that approach was helpful. I didn't come in as the expert. Let me tell you how it's going to be done. But I did find that I was right. That my experience was mirroring a lot of theirs, and was able to really help them think a little bit differently or expand their thinking. Is what it was. I tried not to be intimidated. I don't think I ever came across that way, but it was intimidating sometimes. I mean, your point about really smart people doing really amazing things. Um, and by the way, along those lines, in that area, at least at that point in time, all of those folks were building businesses and doing really amazing work from a technology standpoint, but they also understood really clearly what they wanted to contribute to the world. And I
Hmm.
found that also really inspirational and helpful. That it wasn't just I'm in it to make as much as I can, and then I'm selling. I'm going to exit and have a liquidity event, and I'm out of here. It wasn't that at all. They were interested in building a legacy, and I love that aspect as well. And that was one of the things that I wasn't prepared for quite on the front end of that. I don't know that I had a generalization, but that was really nice. So we were able to focus in on those aspects as well.
Speaking with a client out in the Vail Valley in Colorado, and he was talking about a lot of young tech entrepreneurs, made their first billion with a B, right?
Mhm.
And moved, and they're also looking at it being like they're making the changes in the world with whatever business they created that came out of that geography of California, moved to Colorado, but then this pursuit now of saying, "Oh, that's it. I mean, what else? What do I do next?" Sort of thing. And in some ways, right, that again, that seeking of purpose, whether your personal process, that traditional retirement, that having a liquidity event, people seeking purpose. Am I overplaying that word or that concept? Because it really is not about the money at a certain degree, right? We still all need to pay the
Yeah.
bills and whatnot, but at a certain degree, it's not about the money. Um, how does your family therapy side come alongside those individuals to try to make sense out of their lives?
Absolutely. Well, I think it's like I said, I use it all the time, that those skills to help people think through, because I mean, as you well know, um, I do know people that have had a liquidity event and they go, "Yay, we're going to go, travel the world and and retire." And they might do that. And what I find that unless there is a sense of how we're going to build purpose within that doesn't last very long. And so, again, to help people start thinking through, asking questions that is like, well, what is it you want to accomplish now? Yeah,
Mhm.
are you other than wanting to take some time, fine. What does your life look like? What do you want it to look like? And bringing that word, I think that's the right word. Purpose is the right word, because you can talk about things you want to do, but if they're not grounded someplace, my experience is, and what I suspect is, that people find themselves in very unhappy spots.
Mm.
And so you're right. Of course, money has absolutely zero meaning in those kind of contexts. So,
And it runs a risk of taking them to a dark place, right?
oh,
And that's
totally. Oh, totally.
but then there's the opportunity to step back and say, okay, but you can also use that for good, right? And it could take you to a very bright place.
Yep.
Where do you see some of that division coming in, where you see some people that, the terrible stories we might hear about or read about that make the tabloids, and unfortunately, all the good stories, sometimes get overshadowed from a news flow viewpoint. Where do you see that division start to come into, potentially into an individual's life?
Well, first of all, what I experience as well is that almost to a person, if their view of money, for example, and purpose is already set before there is a liquidity event, they're going to be fine. Or
Mm,
at least it's easier to have a conversation with them about. Let's talk about what comes next. Let's talk about what you want to utilize in what's coming to you, how you want to show up in the world, how you want to continue to show up in the world, what you want to change of how you show up in the world in order to do that. And then people that have not brought that with them already, I think those are the folks that tend to have the biggest challenge, because then you add the weight of something like a liquidity event to their thinking. That's harder. That's a bigger lift, and I find that it's easier if you can get a hold of those conversations and help have them early. The better it is for people. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm working with families. I talk about bringing in teenagers. Let's bring it in. Let's help them start thinking about their purpose if they haven't already done so.
yeah.
Um,
I've got a
and
huge smile on my face, as you can see on the video, right? Uh, as listeners know, we don't have sponsors. We don't pay people. I didn't pay Kent to say those words, but this is what I mean when I get with individuals that are within their businesses, and you start having these conversations, and they're like, okay, well, but John, we'll talk about investments after I sell the business, and it's like that's like a we need to do investment management really well, but that's a low level type item when it comes to talking about your purpose, right? And then how you organize around that, and that clarity of life and meaning and how you're approaching it, let alone the legal structure, the tax structure, and then based on what you want to do. Well, you may organize your affairs, your legal and tax structure to preserve more money for your family, and charity is important to you. And the tax code is set up that way to do that, right? So it's not about, hey, we'll have the event and then we'll figure out life afterwards. The value add of that component being as early as possible, right? Doesn't matter. Maybe you never have an event. Every
right,
sooner or later,
right,
somebody will have an event, right? And we had recent conversations like sooner, if you pass away, you just had an event. So sooner or later,
yes,
somebody will have an event, right?
yes.
But succession of some sort will take place. How do you think about this one and only life that you have and getting that? Don't wait until after the event. You might miss opportunities. You might be paying more in tax than you want to pay. And yet at the same time, yeah, celebrate, right? Take some time off, go enjoy and catch your breath a little bit, but you'll also have clarity regarding how all of this plays forward for yourself too. So I just love what you. So listeners, rewind, listen to that again. What Ken said. If you don't listen to me, listen to Dr. Rhodes here. That is so spot on. And yet, the inertia of people, the tyranny of the urgent, just slows people down.
It does. And also the thought if they think that having money is going to solve things, it doesn't, or it may provide more options, but it doesn't necessarily solve for things that are ultimately important.
Right. And so then this philanthropic topic, right? Because
Yes.
it does blend into all of what we're speaking. I was speaking with a gentleman earlier today, and my dad always had a saying, right? Well, charity starts with the family, right? If we're making sure we're taking care of the family, and then the concentric circles out. Okay, so then once you have, if your family's in a healthy place and you've got good well being in that unit, that extended family unit, then you look at the world around you to say, well, how do you want to make the community better? How do you want to change the world in different ways? And this is this concept of philanthropy. So how do you even frame up for individuals? Well, what is good philanthropy?
Yeah, that's so it again it gets into the whole what's purpose and values and what's most important to you as a family. And generally, that conversation will start with, well, something I mentioned earlier, and that is that, well, we know we provide jobs for however many families in the community or around the world, and
Mhm.
we love that. We know that that's important, and we want to make sure that that stays in place. Like I said, that's great. So, but then we talk a little bit get into that a little bit more deeply about, well, why is that? What's important about that to you? And they'd say, well, because we believe producing well-being and the opportunity for well-being for others beyond our family is important. And
Mhm.
so we just keep digging into the layers, and this is also is not usually one conversation; it's usually several conversations, in which when we can get to, well, what do you see that you are currently being philanthropic with, or your charitable giving? What's around that you might want to build or want to start bringing into it? And so we have that conversation as well. Sometimes that's around a family member. For example, I worked with a family that we had a foundation that was set up to provide funding for research around diabetes because they had diabetes in the family.
Mm.
And so it was a real event to them, or an illness like ALS, another family this is their area where they really focus and do fundraising even beyond their philanthropic efforts around ALS funding. So it becomes very personal, is I guess what I would say, and I talk about it that way. So this is being philanthropic isn't just oh, well, let's set up something and just throw out, help as best we can. Let's
Right.
make it let's make it personal, so that it's something that you can plug into, that your kids can plug into, and that then creates more of a lasting sort of a legacy for the family and moving forward. So those conversations then become really meaningful. And again, the more family members that can engage in that conversation, it makes it a little unwieldy on the front end. But if everybody can build a vision together of what seems important to them as a group, and then begin to start formulating, how do we want to do this? How can we together build something like a foundation that's going to actually make sure that this takes place and happens in the world over a longer period of time?
And so if listeners didn't catch it in the mix, this is you're now stepping out of the academic arena.
Yes.
You're putting on another hat now, and you shared with me. So we want to protect family confidentiality and privacy, but to share a little bit, if you don't mind, just kind of the framework. You've been working with some families for a very extended time that you're deep in relationship with. So this is not a classroom discussion. This is you sitting right alongside and integrated into families in terms of the thoughts. Can you share a little bit more of that just to give a little bit of color and perspective?
Sure. So I work with families around philanthropy and their foundation, all the way from the conversation I just now described, the very, very front end of it. In fact, just finished the conversation. Well, finished. We got to a good point, a plateau with two families. One looking at global philanthropy, very big vision for the world, and the other one a little bit more localized. But in both scenarios, the family come together and have conversations about what's important. The other couple of clients that I have working with right now, we're working on transition. So succession is something that has to be applied in every part of the enterprise. So you might have the business, you think about, well, how are we going to do succession there? But then other parts of the enterprise, like philanthropy, then becomes an equally important conversation around succession. And that also applies to the family office. Like I said, to all parts of the enterprise. So, but thinking about how, from a founder funder individual for a foundation, for example, his or her vision for that, even if it's shared by the family, could change as subsequent generations come in, just because generations have different viewpoints of the world. And so how do we help them think through not only who is it that's going to step in and be chair of the board for the foundation, who is it that's going to manage their staff if it's a large enough foundation, as these are that I'm working with. So it becomes a whole, so some of the same questions you would ask about a business, because it is in many ways a business, or at least that operates that way. And think about it. Well, how do we maintain that vision all the way through generations? And at what point are there opportunities to shift it a little bit depending on the generational views?
Yeah, thank you for sharing that reminder to individuals, because sometimes there's families that are like, well, we want to have the foundation and we want it, and they just think it's like, okay, then we're just writing checks out of the foundation for the sake of charitable purposes. And it's like, well, no, you're setting up a separate business entity, right? I mean, this 501c3
You are.
entity is a
Yep.
business entity. And just because it's a nonprofit doesn't mean you operate it with any less intentionality as you would in your for-profit business. Why does the tax status matter regarding how excellent you run what you're doing? And why would you want to be sloppy in what you're doing, where you're giving away philanthropically, you're giving away those philanthropic capital dollars? You wouldn't do that in your business. Why would you be then, sloppy with that? So adding that same level of intentionality is a starting point. And if you don't want to do that, right, then maybe that's not the right tool to be even applying to the family, because that's all it's going to be. And then you're probably in time going to move it into a donor advised fund just to streamline your granting at that point in time, and call it quits. So there's some of those like warnings on the front end of it. If you're not going into it as a business into itself, don't do it. Is there anything else that would come up as a yellow or red flag to you regarding somebody even considering starting a foundation?
Yes. And I appreciate that you mentioned donor advice funds. There are lots of times that we'll sort of have these conversations and it's clear the family just isn't quite ready to have a broader conversation. So I'll say, well, do individual donor advice funds would be what I would suggest where you start. At least kind of get into that. But yeah, there's sometimes I'll have a conversation with the family. And again, it's not a question of whether or not there's enough wealth or money going around, but it's a question of whether or not they've actually ever thought about how they could leverage some of their wealth to see other opportunities for good in the world. And I find that's a little bit of a harder conversation, because it's not a judgment. There's not a judgment, although I see good things that come from good philanthropy, the well thought out as a business. I do have a bias about that, but if a family doesn't want to be philanthropic, it's okay. They don't have to be. But
Right.
but I also believe, though, that and because of my experience, it's a missed opportunity for the family,
Right.
as well as for the world. So I think that that's one of the challenges. Sometimes helping people, introducing the idea, sometimes and planting the seed is as powerful a thing as I can possibly do. And say, it'd be good to start thinking about how do you want to impact the world. And it folds into very nicely the conversation that we talked about earlier about legacy, and what is your legacy going to be, and beyond you, and what does that look like? So, certainly, yeah, those are challenges that need to be overcome and talked about.
Where we started the conversation earlier, and you were mentioning, even if the conversation is not happening, it's happening, right? Whether it's happening, behind separate closed doors, between other family members, it's happening. And I look at philanthropy a little bit of the same way, where I step back and, again, the three buckets where you're using money for your family, charities, or taxes, that's it. Those are the three places. And if you're not giving intentionality to your charitable bucket as a voluntary philanthropist, involuntarily, you're saying that the government is better at allocating your dollars than
Yep.
you are to make the world a better place. And so you are a philanthropist. You're just an involuntary philanthropist saying that the government is better than you. And I haven't
Yes.
had anybody admit that. And yet it's like they're not willing to roll up the sleeves to be that voluntary philanthropist. So my challenge and my encouragement is going, you get to decide. The tax code is set up to actually incentivize doing this work and doing it really well so that you can shift dollars from that tax bucket into your philanthropic capital. You have to choose whether you want to be a voluntary or involuntary philanthropist.
I love how you say that. Hey, and I haven't quite used that phrase, but I'm going to now. But I talk about that all the time. I say, if you're not being philanthropic, you're telling the government to be. I know I suspect you have feelings about that, and they do. And so it's like,
Yeah, right, right.
why would you relinquish control of some of your money to the government when you're already so anti doing that? But you do it
Right.
willingly. So let's
Right, you do
have
it
another
willingly.
conversation.
Exactly. Whether it be income, estate taxes, I mean, you go through the whole list of it. It's like you get to choose. And now I go back to if you're planning for a liquidity event that exits somewhere down the road, whenever it is,
Yep.
some of these items that you could get put in place in advance of that event can streamline it where the family can end up actually keeping more for themselves and shifting dollars to
Absolutely.
charity to minimize the tax bill that much more. But it takes the planning and the intentionality. And it's not something to be done flippantly or on the spot or let's set this up, but bring that and build to that over time. Back to it all should point to the purpose component.
Yep.
Then we step back from the strategy and then the stewardship aspect of actually managing the foundation and governance. We talk about business governance. We talked about apply that same level of business governance to your not-for-profit entity versus your for-profit. Some people then start to muddy the water a little bit and saying, but the philanthropic board is really our family governance. And I'm kind of like, no. And so you're shaking your head no too. So
Oh,
make that distinguishing factor to be like, yeah, that's not the case.
no. So yeah, that's one of the things we're really clear about, that these are completely separate entities. Now, for example, a family council is a common entity that can be developed. That sometimes we've seen it serve sort of as an overarching piece that in which family members can sit on the family council if they're qualified. So there are qualifications even to do that. And then sometimes from within that, if they meet certain requirements, they might be able to fill a seat for a family member on, say, a foundation board or a family office board. And so, but yes, otherwise, the family council deals with family issues. The foundation board is a professional board, should be a professional board. There might be a couple of seats for a family member that are
Mhm.
designated as that with qualifications. It can't be just anybody can come sit there. Um,
Mhm.
but otherwise, the other seats are people either from the community and or other family foundations that have been very successful over time. Then it repeats the same process, the same business process. What is our strategy? Now it becomes a little bit more narrow because they're not selling widgets. So, but in terms of how do we continue to manage requests? How do we continue to show up in the community?
Yeah.
How do we maintain? For example, one of the families I've worked with had a really clear policy based on their values that they didn't want their name on anything
Mm.
ever. And
Mm.
um, but they also pushed out a lot of money out of their foundation, and so it was a lot of pressure for that. And so the board helped serve to come back to this is the family's value. We do not. We are going to hold this line with them and for them because this is part of their desire.
Mm.
And so even to that extent, that became embedded as a part of the strategy for the family in their philanthropy. But and again, that's not prescriptive, and there's no judgment of that. If another
Yeah.
family has a different view, that's great. But this was
Right.
that particular family.
Right.
Um, um,
It's the intentionality and it's the making it a conscious decision, right? Being that voluntarily being engaged in making these decisions, whatever you decide those the vision is to align with your purpose, to align with your worldview, right? To incorporate your faith in terms of, how that plays out for yourself, right? Making the world what you think is a better place and getting behind those organizations and do encourage. I'd be curious to your take, right? I'm a firm believer, engage with fewer and go deeper organizations than just trying to spread a little bit all over the place.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so I know that. And yet there's conflict that comes up with that. So another family that I've worked with and very closely for in making transition from G1 to G3, and to a multi-generation foundation instead of a G1, is that you can imagine the 30-year-olds have a different view of the world. And for example, they're very concerned about, in this particular case, global warming.
Hmm.
And so that, and they're wishing they could provide something around some research around that. But the original vision for the foundation was we want to work within very specific geographic areas around homelessness, and so it's there. They can plug into that, they can buy into it, and they share that vision. But they also go, but couldn't we also include something here? And so it's a little bit of a challenge to think about how do we build in some flexibility for subsequent generations' viewpoint and experience in the world that doesn't shift the original vision too far away from what it's supposed to be. And I find that's an interesting conversation to have about, well, here's what's important to this group. How do we make sure that the original vision for these funds don't disappear, but
Yeah.
still maybe be able to wrap in some of these other values that the younger generation has.
So I'm smiling again because there's a family we're working with, and we're looking at getting them the book Mission Drift,
Yes.
written by Peter Greer, right?
Yep.
Because that first generation, especially if the first generation is or the living oldest generation is the first generation entrepreneurial wealth creator. Even though the funds may be sitting in the philanthropic platform, there is the aspect of ownership, controllership, right? That may come into play with that, and yet on one hand, yeah, we want to engage the next generations. We want to bring the family together around this. We want to unify it as long as they align with our values. And it's like, yeah, but they may at the core, and there might be other things that they're interested in, like you're speaking to. And so how do you end up with that, the mission of that entity to allow for flexibility and then also encourage those subsequent generations to say, your only philanthropy doesn't have to come out of the family's foundation. You could be doing things on your own. You're a very capable individual in your own right to go off and do those things for yourself that you believe in as you're part of this collective. It's a both and, not an either or. And unfortunately, I think too often, sometimes within families, especially with great wealth, they feel like they've got to be so aligned to the core family unit that they can't actually be off individually to be doing any of the philanthropy on their own. You're shaking your head again in affirmation too, which I'm encouraged by that you've
Yeah,
seen this as well.
yeah, I love what you're saying because that's certainly, especially in one of the cases I'm involved in, G3 is 23 people, and so they have their own combined wealth, whether they would call themselves wealthy or not, they have combined really an amazing resource. And so that has become actually one of the things that one of their solutions is like, well, we're gonna make sure that we uphold grandma's vision for the foundation, and we're going to uphold that, and we're going to start doing something on our own as well. And that may not be structured so much as a 501(c) or a foundation per se, but they will do a combined donor advised fund and grow that. And that's been a really good solution for at
That's
least that
fantastic.
family.
Yeah, yeah, and that's why it's both and.
It
And
is.
for people in the multiple dimensions. Well, as our time starts winding down, you take all of this work too, and then bring this to the Family Business Consulting Group.
Yes.
I know we've hit on different aspects, but if you can share just a few minutes on who is the Family Business Consulting Group and what kind of work do you do there?
Yes, founded 30 years ago by Craig Aronoff and John Ward. John Ward, especially, was one of the first people to really start working around working with families, and based out of Kellogg, out of Chicago. Um, and and John's and Craig's, both their vision for a group of people who would come alongside families and support them in having some of these more difficult conversations and the thinking through strategy and aligning family strategy with business strategy and the parallel strategic planning process is what John called it. Um, really set up a really nice foundation for doing just that, coming alongside of families of larger enterprises. And what we find is that our work, and by the way, all of my colleagues, again, I'm so fortunate that my colleagues, both in my academic world and in my consulting world, are people that I would choose as colleagues and friends in any context. They're people of very high standards, of high ethics. They understand families really, really well. And they understand the challenges there. And it's interesting that in not just my experience, but of my colleagues as well, it's not unusual for a family to call and say, well, here's what we need. And we, talk about that. Here's what we can do, and we can help you do these things. But once we get in and have a relationship with them, we become trusted advisors. And we find that there are other things that they are needing to work on as well. But we never upsell, which is one of the things I love about this group of people. Is like, hey, we say, no, we've done what we said we needed to do, but we continue work. So my point is, it's not unusual for a relationship to continue on, because there's other work that needs to be done. And we find that sometimes families find it difficult to develop that sort of trusting relationship with someone that understands both their family and parts of their enterprise, and can keep them on. And at the same time, when we're working with a family like that, we don't serve as a board member. That's a separate thing altogether, and it will help them seat board members, and have done really nice work doing that as well. We find very specific people to build their boards as one of our points of service. But I think we're really clear about that. So I really enjoy that. I enjoy the perspective about we're here to support families. We want them to be successful. And we have a belief that because over 90% of the world's businesses are family owned and operated, something like that. We understand that the family businesses make the world go around, literally. And we also understand the power that they have in terms of their potential philanthropy, for example, and the good that they bring to the world. And in general, that's just the case. And of course, you mentioned a while ago, we read in tabloids, or we see on Netflix, these shows about succession or things like that. And those kind of scenarios are they're the outliers. That's not our experience in general. And so, typically the people I get to work with are really solid human beings, and are people that I can care about, and I can work with, and I can help, and I can develop the kind of relationship with that we both benefit from. And that's meaningful for everyone. And that's how we get work done.
Family business starts with the family. And if the family's not flourishing, what's the point of the business? I mean, there's that aspect of that intersection coming together.
Exactly.
Before I do go rapid fire on you here, how would people get a hold of you? How do they find out more about Family Business Consulting Group? How do they get in contact with you if they want to reach out?
www.thefbcg.com, thefbcg.com. And call there, and there are people there that can help, and what we'll do is somebody will take a call of an inquiry and get a better sense of what the family is looking for. And then they'll do a search through our firm about who is the best fit for that. But I also get calls directly, of course, and my email address is probably the best way to do that. And it's just Rhodes, like the scholar, Rhodes, RHODES at thefbcg.com. The best way to just reach out.
And we'll get that included in the. So then, as we go into rapid fire, then.
Yes.
What book are you currently reading now that's that you're just being inspired by, challenged by, entertained by?
Yes, I'm thinking, because there's several of them here, and I want to eliminate any textbooks I'm reading. So, but there's a book called Paradoxes, and it's fascinating in terms of talking about, even though it doesn't use case studies from family enterprises specifically, really describes a lot of scenarios within organizations and working with people in which there are paradoxes that you bump up against all the time. And I found that language to be really helpful to help people think about that. Sometimes it's not a yes or no or right or wrong. Sometimes it's a tension that just needs to be managed, and you can do that. And if you think of it that way, it opens up all sorts of creativity and development.
Paradoxus.
Mhm.
We'll definitely, I'm looking over on the side here too. It's like, we better write that down and make sure we get that linked in. When we were off camera, right before we started, we were talking about certain world travels.
Mhm.
What's your favorite place in the world to go to and visit?
Well, one of my best. Well, I love Australia. I have friends in Australia, and so I love visiting there. I've been there many, many times. So I would say that that's true. But I think that another thing that several years ago, when I was a little younger, did some trekking. A lot of people trek through Europe. I trekked through Papua New Guinea and Borneo
Hmm.
for several months, and loved that experience. I loved being out in the bush. I loved meeting indigenous people and trying to learn a little bit about their culture. Even had an opportunity to work with Barute Galticus, who just recently passed.
Hmm.
She was one of the women that Professor Leke assigned to primates, and she was
Hmm.
assigned to orangutans.
Hmm.
She asked me, "How long have you been in this area?" And I said, "Well, at that point, I'd been there around about 6 weeks in the area." She said, "I need some help taking some orphaned orangutans out to our rehabilitation farm.
Oh my gosh.
Can you spend several days with us?" And I said, "Sure." So, I was given a 1-year-old orangutan to hold as we took a boat out down the river, down a couple of days' journey. It
Oh,
was
that's
lovely.
fantastic. That's
Yeah. So,
fantastic. We started out talking about, legacy as you reflect, talked about purpose. We talked about how all this works. When you step back and think about your legacy and the impact that you want to, leave on the world during this one and only life, uh, what would you want? What would you want people to be remembering about you?
you're asking a hard question at the very end here, John.
Sorry.
No, no, no. Well, no, it actually isn't that hard. I think that I'm hoping my legacy is this really clear that everyone, not just families, but everyone that I come in contact with, that their lives are lifted, and that they also deepen their thinking a little bit. And then in terms of the work that I do, that organizations become more productive. And I don't mean by that make more money. I mean be more productive in the world and bring things to their communities. And to me, all of this is spiritual work. I mean, so it just my definition of spirituality is very broad, and I look at this as that way. So I would, lifting spirits is I think part of what I do naturally, and I hope that I'm known for that.
Yeah. Thank you so much for this conversation, taking the time out of your very busy schedule. You have a lot on your plate. I've enjoyed getting to know you, this conversation, the dialogue. Hopefully, we have opportunities to serve people together to make the world a better place and lift the spirits of all that are out there just a little bit better than maybe we find it on a daily basis. Thank you again, Kent, and have a blessed day. Listeners, if you do want to reach out, send us an email at clearconversations@ccpwealth.com. We can get you in contact. We can share more about the Family Business Consulting Group. I encourage you to check out some of the programs out at Pepperdine. There's just so many resources. So thank you for taking the time to dial in, listen in, I should say, and join us in this conversation. With that, have a blessed day.